The Devil May Cry series has been going on for roughly over 18 years now, and in those years, the series has had its highs and its lows respectively, though it is generally agreed among fans that the biggest hiccup for the series comes from the infamous Devil May Cry 2, coming out 2 years after the original and critically panned for being a huge step down in variety, difficulty, and characters, with most fans finding Dante's change to be too drastic from his original incarnation as they felt that he came off a little too monotone. Though, for all of its blunders, I feel Devil May Cry 2 is still a very important game to the history of the series. And while there are a dozen videos detailing what Devil May Cry 2 did wrong, I felt it would be nice to talk about the history of why the game went the way it did, its development, and look at some of the things that the game did right that ultimately helped grow the series in the future. So I want to start by reaffirming that this video is not about justifying Devil May Cry 2 as some sort of underrated gem of a game, or secretly good in some way. Being completely blunt, Devil May Cry 2 is a half-finished mess of a project which has only been able to be salvaged by future choices later in the series. The story is mostly incomplete and unfocused, and finally, the gameplay is the weakest that the series provides, with the combo game especially being extremely flaccid, which is a serious issue for a series that prompts itself on its combo system. And one of the key factors for this is due to the extremely unnecessary buff to Dante's pistols, where they originally intended to be a combo extender and not an actual kill tool. It also seriously lacked any serious variety to the game that makes it a slog to play through more than once. Now, with that all being said, no one really wants to make a bad game on purpose, so there must have been a good reason for all of this, and that reason actually lies in the game's rocky development. Because, you see, this is all due to Capcom at the time trying to capitalize and cash in on the surprise success of the first game. They called for a rushed development on a sequel via a B team, while the original Team Devil, the group that made the first game, was not informed about the development at all. Hell, Hideki Kamiya was working on a novel for Devil May Cry 1, which detailed Dante's backstory, when he heard about the game for the first time, and it was already in the middle of its development. Adding to this, Capcom's intention with Devil May Cry 2 was to go bigger and better than the last one, saying that the game will have areas 9 times larger than the original, and the graphics would be significantly upgraded. Along with this, they revamped the camera system after the complaints from people about Devil May Cry 1's camera, and they also added an entire second campaign due to people complaining that Trish was not playable in the first one, which not only gave people what they wanted, but doubled the game's runtime, theoretically, making it seem more appealing. So the aim was high when it came to making Devil May Cry 2, but it was the development that kept it grounded, as it was an extremely slow and rough process, all of the blame really being placed on the reliance of a B team to outshine the original when they were a bit unexperienced, and of course the extremely poor direction of a still unnamed director. Then around 4 to 5 months before the release of the game, the unnamed director was dropped from the project and the remnants of the game had to be salvaged by Hideki Itsuno, who tried his best to do what he did to save Devil May Cry 2. And once in the director's seat, Itsuno worked for 4 months straight trying to finish this project, trying his best to focus the game into a more reasonable size and direction. But, given the time restraints and the mess that was laid before his feet, Itsuno can only do so much to keep this thing together, thus resulting in a bit of a mess of a story to follow with a lot of cut content and also a lot less tight controls than someone might have wanted. But, Devil May Cry 2 was sort of used as a foundation for future titles in the series that Itsuno could springboard off of if he needs to. And I mean, some people say that heavy restrictions and limitations can lead to more creative ideas for the future of a project, and I feel the story of Devil May Cry 2 might actually be a result of this. So let's discuss the story of Devil May Cry 2. Starting first with the common misconception people make when playing Devil May Cry 2, and that's that they assume this is Dante's story in any way. Now, I'm not blaming you for thinking this, because the game doesn't really make it clear at all that this is not true. In fact, the structure of the game makes it seem like Dante will be more important to the events. Hell, he was using all the advertisements and marketing for the game, and he's even on the cover.
Dante is back. The ultimate sequel to the ultimate adventure. Unleash your inner demon. Devil May Cry 2. Cooler than hell. Only from Capcom.
This feels like it's going to be Dante's next big journey. even making it the first disc of a 2-disc game, made even worse when they refer to Lucia's campaign as Playthrough 2, when Devil May Cry 2 is mostly her story. It's the actual lore that we're given in the game, instead of having to pick up lore for Dante from art books and other source material released later, which is reinforced even more now when you look back at the games and you realize Dante has no reason to be the protagonist of another game, since he accomplishes his goals in Devil May Cry 1 and just is living out his life doing his jobs. This aspect of the story is why Dante feels so divorced from the main plot, as his only motivation is sort of shoehorned in when Ergosax, the only demon strong enough to force Sparta into sealing him instead of killing him, was unsealed by Arius, the main villain of Devil May Cry 2, and also when Balverk shows up to have a grudge match with Dante because he has a grudge with Dante's dad for killing his allies in a war that happened thousands of years ago. So for the most part, Dante's story in Devil May Cry 2 not only isn't told directly to the player, but is just him cleaning up the messes from his family bloodline and showing, through his defeat of Ergosax, that he has become stronger than his father was. It's a lot of what Dante actually ends up being in future games like Devil May Cry 4 and Devil May Cry 5, where he's just sort of a supporting character who you get to play as sometimes, just with a bit more flair and imitating the personality of the more positively received Devil May Cry 3 Dantes. Though you might ask, if Dante isn't the main character of the story, then who is? Well, that's actually the artificial mannequin demon herself, Lucia, and her struggle with her perception of humanity. This is actually one of the highlights for Devil May Cry 2 if you ask me. Lucia's story is probably the best aspect of the game, and it fits quite well with the major tone of Devil May Cry as a whole, which is humanity versus demons. Lucia's whole journey is that of a demon who believes themselves to be human, only to find out they are what they've been hunting all along. And on top of finding out that their life is a lie, they also learn that they were created by Arius, the main villain of Devil May Cry 2. And while this does set her back, she still believes strongly that she can be human, versus her human creator, who wants to be a demon by absorbing a god of chaos, desiring nothing but the natural power of a demon. But her ideals of wanting to be human helps her overcome her creator, who was human, and defeats Arius at his full power. In fact, Dante even comments on situations like this in the Devil May Cry anime and in Devil May Cry 4 itself.
It's about souls. Basically, here's the story, Sid. Someone like you who's let his soul rot can't measure up by just getting some power. Not to someone with a real soul. That's not how it works down here.
How can there be such a difference between us?
You surrendered your humanity. It's that simple.
Which is quite impressive when you realize that she is an artificial mannequin demon, one of the most basic enemies in the game, but her believing in her humanity is enough to help her overpower a supercharged demon, someone who has the power of Ergosax, the Chaos, which we know is quite a feat due to the fact that Sparta, our basis for an extremely powerful demon throughout the series, had to seal Ergosax instead of actually just directly killing him. You also have the underlining fool's journey that Dante and Lucia partake in throughout the events of Devil May Cry 2, which we see through the tarot card suit themed major plot points of the game, like the 4 holy relics needing to be collected, all based on the 4 major suits, which is coin, blade, cup, and staff. Along with this, you also have the characters which match up with the arcanas of the tarot, like Arius, who is the reverse magician arcana, which is a representation of a person blinded by their own magical ability, or just abilities in general. Arius is then also looking for strength through the power of the devil. You also have Matiere, who is the hermit and acts as a guide for each of the fools on their journey as they head to the tower to defeat the magician. A lot of the game is actually very connected to tarots and arcana, and I think it's an actually really neat thing to look for when you play the game. I also really wish we could have seen what Devil May Cry 2 would have looked like if Itsuno was there to direct from the start and we got to see these themes fully fleshed out. Though speaking of playing the game, one of the things I noticed while I was playing Devil May Cry 2 is how much the game feels like it's a beta or testing ground for some of the movement options in Devil May Cry 3, such as the great wall running for the trickster style or the gunplay of the gunslinger style. In fact, one of the most enjoyable things about Devil May Cry 2 is how mobile Dante and Lucia are in comparison to Devil May Cry 1's Dante. Though if we're talking about experimental gameplay, we can also talk about how Devil May Cry 2 is the perfect experiment on what not to do in future games, such as never making the gun such a viable damage option ever again. We see this in future games, especially ones directed by Itsuno, that the gun damage never actually matches up with sword damage unless it is fully charged, and that's usually to combo with a sword attack, or you're using some gun-specific fighting style like Gunslinger. Itsuno also made sure to make gunplay a lot more fun and engaging than they were in Devil May Cry 2, where the dominant strategy was to stand still and shoot. From Devil May Cry 2 on, the guns returned to their place as a combo extender. Along with this, Hideki Itsuno made sure that in future games, weapon upgrades were more distinct, not only in damage variety, but in playstyle, as Devil May Cry 2 had a lot more gun variety than they had sword variety, though this was mostly due to time constraints, as Itsuno himself said he originally planned to have more crazy weapons, like a motorcycle weapon that you would get around the time you got the Coyote shotgun in 2, and that wasn't even realized until Devil May Cry 5 what that would have been like. I'd even argue that we see glimpses of the Devil May Cry style and charm originating from this game. Now, of course, they only appear for brief segments, mostly during the early game and a few boss fights, but during those moments, the game feels pretty good and close to a full Devil May Cry experience. Some examples being the reoccurring rival battles with Bulwark, or of course the final boss battles against Ergo Sax and Arius. I'd even argue that Dante, when he does stuff in this game, shows glimpses of the Dante we all know and love, and his more serious tone fits with the game's positioning in the timeline. As we even see in the animated Devil May Cry series, he has a very similar personality, and this is all due to it being retconned that he is still grieving his brother's death at the hands of him during the events of Devil May Cry 1, which harkens back to the events of Devil May Cry 3, which are written after this game. And we even see segments of the future Dante's personality shining through in things like his coin trick, which play very well into his character acting aloof or not in control of things when he's probably the person who understands what's going on the most and has the most control in any given situation. It's actually a very Dante thing to do, and it's probably the reason why that sticks with so many people when they think about Devil May Cry 2. Well, they either think of the coin trick or these two extremely Kino moments.
My life! I was going to be the king of this world!
King? Yeah. Here's your crown.
But in my opinion, one of the coolest things that Devil May Cry 2 actually does was they have the different Devil Trigger forms based on the power-up gems that you have collected, allowing you to do different types of damage or have access to different movement abilities such as running faster or flight, which I feel offered a good bit of variety where the game was extremely lacking in that category. It also made your gun shoot a lot faster so you could get through bosses that you didn't like a lot quicker. Now, even though most of its gameplay changes were ignored in future releases, there are a lot of things that Devil May Cry 2 introduces to the series plot-wise that actually get expanded on later in the series. That sure, weren't major in the game that they debuted in, but were huge plot points for future titles, such as Dante's iconic Sword Rebellion, which not only plays a big role in Itsuno's next game, Devil May Cry 3, where the sword awakens Dante's Devil Trigger, but also in Devil May Cry 5, where it's used to reawaken the Shin Devil Trigger or the Majin Devil Trigger, which was actually a secret Devil Trigger introduced in Devil May Cry 2, which sure, you could only access if you used your DT when you only had 10% of your health or lower, explaining to the player that it was a bit of a last-ditch effort for Dante, though Itsuno admitted that because of this, a lot of players didn't realize that that was even implemented into the game at all and would miss out on it, which is why he worked to bring it back in whatever way he can, ultimately resulting in the glorious return in the aforementioned Devil May Cry 5. And actually, that kind of summarizes Devil May Cry 2 in a nutshell. It presents a lot of really cool ideas such as Lucia, Dante's endless struggle with cleaning up his family's messes, or the Majin transformation, to even more fluid movement options and style switching, but they're executed in a less than stellar way, resulting in a game that is not great by any means, but not as terrible as a lot of people write it off as. In fact, Devil May Cry 2's legacy as an awful game has sort of created a countercultural movement of people who refer to it in a very positive manner. It's become a game that is so widely understood as not that great that to shit on it or call it bad is sort of redundant. You're not really achieving anything, but to find a little bit of beauty within it is almost a beautiful and wholesome thing, where now you have people who, ironically or unironically, are enjoying the game and giving it an actual shot, creating this very positive aspect. And even though Devil May Cry 2 survived almost mainly on its infamy as the black sheep of the series, kind of worked in its benefit. So, if you're interested in the game at all from me going through and talking about it, I recommend picking up a copy. It's extremely cheap if you want to get it on PS2, or if you're wanting to get it on a more modern console, Devil May Cry 2 comes packaged with everything on the HD collection, which contains 1 and 3, which are also amazing games, so you aren't taking too much of a gamble, and who knows, maybe you'll find out by playing it that you actually like it. Or maybe you won't. Only you can decide. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MediNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to add something else to your cart to keep your copy of Devil May Cry 2 warm on its holiday travels, well, I have a great option for you. That's Shimonetta, a boring world where the concept of dirty jokes doesn't exist, that you can get at buyshimonetta.com.